There's Rocky again. Again, I don't know if you can see him, but there he is, if you can see him. Yeah. I'm going to tell you another story. This one is about my cousin. Not my cousin Alan, who was in the last story, but my cousin Julie, who was about a year younger than me. I'll have to give you a little background first. I started school in 1973. That's when I started kindergarten in Perth at St. John's separate school, they were called back then. Catholic schools were called separate schools back then. It was the separate school system. That's where we were at. The public schools were different, but we were in Catholic school, so we went to separate schools. And I started in 73, and the first bus I rode on was this beat-up old bus. It was like a 1949 or something like that, Chev school bus. And, back then they run a bus until it literally fell apart. They'd run it until you just absolutely couldn't drive it anymore. And nowadays, of course, they go the opposite, and they force them off the road at 10 years old, regardless of what shape they're in. But around here they do anyway. But we kind of went from having no regulations, or next to no regulations, to having too many regulations, and I guess that happens. Backlash, something happens, and then they go the opposite way or whatever, So that's what happened. But when I started school, there were still a lot of old school buses on the road. And this old bus was pretty scary because it was noisy and, it was rough. It would smoke and backfire and all kinds of stuff. I had a storybook when I was a kid called the Bingity Bangity School Bus. And the first bus I ever rode on, I would say, was the Bingity Bangity School Bus, anyway. And our bus driver was a fellow by the name of Bruce Thompson. And Bruce Thompson was a real cool guy, He didn't care about anything, really. He just did it. He was a good bus driver. He was a really good driver, but he pretty much let you do your own thing, As long as you didn't kill anybody on his bus, he didn't care, really. And what we used to do is we used to ride into town on the high school bus. There were a bunch of us younger kids rode on the high school bus, and then we'd get dropped off by Bruce Thompson at the high school, and we'd have to wait there, and our school was on the other side of town. So we'd wait there at the high school, and then a fella by the name of Fonzie McKinnon. He was an old man, I remember. He had a bald head with a white fringe around his white fringe of hair though around his skull, but a bald head otherwise. And he drove this big old bus there. It was a big old International Harvester. And I remember the big white steering wheel in it and everything, and him just leaning over. He was a tiny man, and he'd be leaned over that wheel, cranking it around, going around corners in town and stuff, and then bringing it all the way back. And sometimes in warm weather, the sweat would just be pouring off his forehead, and stuff. And anyway, again, nice man, and doing a hard job, a lot of responsibility, just a very hard job. But we called that bus the town bus. Anyway, but my first day of school, I see this bus coming at me. Anyway, I'm standing by the side of the road with the neighbor girls, and of course they were used to it. They had ridden on it lots of times because they were older than I was. And I'm standing on the side of the road, and I see this thing coming, and I think, oh boy, I was already a little nervous, so that I saw that bus. And I was used to riding in rough old vehicles. And it wasn't so much the vehicle that bothered me. It was all the noise of the people in the vehicle. There were guys in there roaring their heads off, just roaring out the windows. There were pieces of paper and apples and things flying out the windows. They were just winging things out the windows, I think half of them lost their lunch on the way to school, really, throwing stuff out the windows. And these were the high school boys, and they sat at the back of the bus. I got on that bus, and I was terrified. but you didn't let anybody know you were scared. If you were a boy back then, that was the kiss of death, to let anybody know you were frightened of anything. Truth is, I was scared out of my mind most of the time, but I was not going to let anybody know that. So, what do? I go straight to the back of the bus where the roughest of the rough are, where the guys are sitting back there. They were smoking cigarettes and telling dirty stories. They used to get these magazines called Easy Rider magazines, it was like an outlaw biker magazine, and they had a centerfold with a naked girl straddling a Harley and all that, Anyway, I went right back there with that crowd because I wasn't going to let on I was scared. I'm pretty sure they knew I was scared, but I think they kind of respected me for screwing up my courage and going back there. They used to tease me, and they were quite the bunch. And like I say, they'd be smoking cigarettes and looking at these magazines and throwing stuff out the windows and everything. And there was one fella back there, he had red hair, and he looked just like Archie Andrews from the comic books. And I used to call him Archie Andrews. I used to call him Archie all the time. I knew that wasn't his name, but that's what I called him. And he used to call me Pipsqueak and, all that stuff. What's up, Pipsqueak? Like that. He'd come back there. Hey, what's up, Pipsqueak? And he'd read me stories from the Easy Rider magazine as if he was reading me a bedtime story. And it'd be some story about some field party that the bikers had, and he'd be reading it in that voice, like that. So we had a righteous good time, and we consumed many beverages, Then a bunch of fellows showed up from such and such a chapter, and they were good dudes, and we partied hardy till the wee hours of the morning. He'd read it like that to me anyway, and he'd show me a picture, the centerfold picture of the girl or whatever, and he'd say, now what would you do if you had that? And of course I didn't know what I'd do if I had that, but I didn't want to let on that I didn't know what I'd do, so I'd just say, oh, I'd figure it out. He'd start laughing, he'd say, yeah, I bet you would too, And it was a big joke anyway, but I kind of made friends with those guys anyway. We kind of enjoyed each other, I guess, in a funny kind of a way. And every so often, though, Bruce Thompson, he'd look up in that overhead mirror that school buses have, and he'd yell to the back of the bus. He called them reprobates. He'd say, settle down, you reprobates. Like that, eh? He'd yell at them, settle down, you bunch of reprobates. Of course, he didn't really care. He'd just do that every so often, I think, just to join in more than anything. And we're going down the road anyway, and that's how it was. They'd be throwing apples out the windows and papers and things, pens, whatever, pencils, whatever, And anyway, I wasn't on the bus when this particular thing happened. I would have boarded the bus later, so I don't remember this from first-hand memory. But my grandmother told me the story. Our grandma did. She told me the story because on our cousin Julie's first day of school, which was a year later, because she was a year younger than me, she got on the bus, and I do remember she used to sit right behind Bruce Thompson in the seat right behind him, and she used to be very shy. She was always looking down at the floor and trying not to be noticed, just kind of shrinking into the seat kind of thing. And anyway, I guess the first day of school when she got on the bus, and like I say, I would have gotten on the bus after this happened. I would have been there that day, I'm sure, but I just didn't see this happen or hear it happen. But they're going down the road, and, Julie, she's sitting there all kind of hunched into herself, and looking down and trying not to be noticed, just trying to blend into the furniture, I guess you could say, or blend into the seat or whatever. And, of course, the guys at the back of the bus, they were cutting up as usual, roaring and throwing stuff and, play fighting and all the other stuff that they do. And Bruce Thompson, he was quite a card anyway. He looked up in the mirror and he yelled back at them. And this is what he said. He yelled, settle down, you bunch of reprobates, or I'll send Julie Fernie back there to beat the piss out of you. And you could imagine my cousin Julie was so shy, And she was frightened, you know. She, maybe it wasn't a good thing. But this is what happened. And how I know the story is my grandmother told me the story. Years later, she told me the story. And I guess she had been talking to Julie sometime after that, and Julie was mad. And she says to our grandma, she says, "I'm so mad at that Bruce Thompson, you won't believe what he did." And she told Grandma the story anyway about him threatening the older boys, the high school boys, that she'd go back there and straighten them out, you know. So anyway, that's the story there. It's another kind of a comical story. And anyway, I hope my cousin Julie doesn't mind me telling it, you know. But yeah, like I say, I wasn't a witness to it. I think it was the first day of school. I may be mistaken. It might have been another day. They live further up along the route than I did, so they were on the bus first. You know, my cousins, they were always on the bus first. And it happened sometime between when they got on and when I got on, so I wasn't actually there to see it. I just heard about it from my grandma. She told me the story years later, you know. So anyway, that's the story. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you all later.